Hello guys. Are we expecting anybody else? Or is Paul going to join today?
No, he won't be joining today. He has some personal stuff.
I guess then we can start. Uh, yeah, if there is no, I mean, if anybody has, there is no specific items on the agenda, but if there is any specific point somebody wants to put up or talk, we can. Shashi and I can give a slight update on what we have been doing. Maybe apart from that, we don't have anything else.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to talk about.
Okay, so I have been working on that high level controller. So I think we did talk about this in the same sync 2 weeks ago. And what I am doing is, or my intention was to write a high level controller for one type, which sort of puts same or similar code which exists in V1 as of now, sort of puts parity over there, and same functionality can be done using the new API, which I call the replica scheduling API. And what it does is, if user creates this replica scheduling resource, and if a same named template, deployment template exists, then it will monitor the replicas, sorry, the deployments in the underlying clusters and update the template and overrides to correct or do the whatever scheduling stuff it intends to do. Uh, and the implementation, the controller implementation that I have done right now is sort of similar to Sync controller. Like, it's not very different from Sync controller, except for the reconcile and rest of the stuff that it needs to do. And it's specific for deployment type. And what I did evaluate before this is, there is an auto-generated scaffolding for controllers in the API server builder itself when you bootstrap the API. So I did try and evaluate the usage of that. That is also doable. But we also have this open item that if we move to CRDs or not. So in that case, that's scaffolding and writing the controller that way might not be very super useful. Uh,
Yeah,
that
the
is,
scaffolding I think it makes a lot of assumptions that I don't really think are borne out in Federation. Principally among them, the idea that you're just going to have one controller per type. Like I think it's far more likely, even for scheduling, that you'll have a controller that can.
for multiple types.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So, I mean, when I was originally contemplating, re-implementing or moving over the sync controller, I looked at the generated controllers like skeleton, and I was like, this is completely not useful. So,
Mhm. The only useful part I saw over there is that they have some auto-generated code for unit testing. But given that we sort of integrate three different servers, that also might not be super useful for us. Means we would need to update the auto-generated code itself to make it useful. So
yeah, like to my mind, I think I don't know. It's good maybe as an example of maybe the current state of the art for unit testing of controllers. At least that would be my hope, but I don't think we could actually use the code itself.
cool. I think we are talking about the same. I mean, we are talking on the same lines. I just wanted to mention this, that I did evaluate. I mean, in case this point comes up, that why did I not use that particular scaffolding?
Yeah, no, I
Uh,
think you're doing the right thing.
okay, cool. This other point which might be a little contentious is, as I mentioned, that I have implemented this for only the deployment type right now. So some portion of the code is a little generic, but some portion is very specific to deployments type. Uh, my intention is to do it in steps, because if I try to put, say, a kind of an adapter which can take in different types and provides an interface which can do scheduling within reconcile, all of it in one PR might be a little too much to review and too much to do. So my intention is to do it in steps.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I mean, the experience that I think we're having on the sync controller side is like, because I'm focused right now on supporting CRDs, and in the process, it's kind of it's changing a lot of the assumptions that the sync controller was making about using types and using adapters. So effectively, adapters are going to go away. And so my expectation is that eventually, I'm not saying setting any timeline, but eventually, probably even the scheduling controllers would take that sort of strategy, which is to not have any or have as little type specific behavior as possible and just have classes of behavior. So rather than like worrying about replica sets or deployments for the simple scheduling case, you just worry about replica count as a field, which is a lot easier to deal with. I'm not saying approaching that now. That's just kind of like ideas. I'm like, the whole adapter concept was my first stab at moving away from having type specific controllers, and moving further along that path has been kind of interesting because it means, you don't actually have to write code for many cases. I'm not saying we get away from it entirely, but to me, it's promising.
Yep, that's correct. And one more intention of me doing this is because this is probably this is maybe call it first high-level type controller, which will completely rely on the three basic types or the sync controller. So it can sort of verify the whole loop completion also.
Right.
Irfan,
Yep.
a couple questions. First off, I guess, where are you working on this? Is there a specific repo that you're working on?
Yeah, my personal fork of Federation V2.
Okay. Okay.
You mean the branch? Which branch?
I'm just wondering if you foresee this being integrated with the existing Federation code, or if you're seeing this as some separate repo that consumes the API from the Federation V2 repo.
No. That we concluded in earlier, right? That we would, like Shashi already has raised a couple of PRs. I also raised the PR for this, and I would be pushing all my changes onto the PR that I raised in Federation V2. That's what I mean.
Okay. And then as another question, I guess I would also, do you plan on, or what's your strategy for implementing tests for the scheduling stuff? I think that if you can plan on having tests early on to validate it and running it in an end-to-end environment, I think will be really good as you progress to make changes to support additional types.
Yep. So I haven't concluded. The thought in my mind is that I'll actually be using the integration framework, which is already there for the tests, and I haven't started with the tests explicitly for this particular stuff. So currently what I have implemented is the controller and sort of manually figuring out what's it's doing the right thing or not. But yes, in the same PR, I'll follow that up with the test and using the integration framework, which is already there in Federation V2.
Okay.
Did you mean something else, like maybe think about adding some stuff to the framework itself, which might be useful for high-level controllers, which use the lower-level sync controller?
No, I think there's possibilities of reuse there. The existing tests are really more just CRUD operations, whereas you're probably looking at some sort of dynamic scheduling behavior and validating that certain
Correct.
removals,
you're right
triggers, balancing. So there might be opportunities to reuse some of it, but it sounds like it's going to be a little bit separate, where you might want to build on the same framework, but possibly have a separate test that tests just the scheduling components.
You're right about it. So when I said reuse the integration framework, I mean because it already has some setup, which it can do. Set up all three servers and provide running endpoint which the clients can talk to. That much I can reuse, and rest of the stuff would be separate from the CRUD, which is there in integration as of now.
I mean, in the ideal case, though, I mean, you might need some, like a test that ties it all together and makes sure, yeah, when I try to schedule something, it does actually carry through. But the other sort of strategy could be validating that the right resources are created. So rather than even worrying about interaction with the underlying clusters, like just do it in stages. Can I read information from the underlying clusters is one part. Can I write can I write the resources that the sync controller expects? And then the part of actually synchronizing is kind of, that's what the sync controller is doing, and you don't really have to exhaustively test that, in the context of scheduling. You need to make sure it all ties together, but I think that it might simplify the testing if you sort of break it into pieces.
You're right, Merv. I'll certainly take that in consideration.
I'm not trying to be prescriptive, because I mean, you got to evaluate. You got to make sure that it's correct according to your expectations. I'm just lazy. I don't like doing lots of work that I don't have to.
No, please feel free to prescribe stuff. It's always useful. So, I mean.
I doubt that's true, but it's kind of you to say.
Just a very quick question about testing and terminology. So kind of traditionally we had unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. Unit tests being, testing specific pieces of code, typically one class or a collection of classes, and integration being pulling a bunch of controllers or pieces of software together and testing essentially the interfaces between them and making sure they talk to each other. And then end-to-end being, this is a federated replica set or deployment or whatever it is, and this is how users expect it to behave, and then we have tests to verify that, irrespective of how the underlying pieces interact with each other or the underlying pieces of classes or code work. The end user behavior should be as per the spec. Are we still using that distinction between the three kinds of tests? Is that terminology that I just described accurate?
I think the lines are blurring between integration and end-to-end. I mean, some of the work that we've done on V2 actually allows you to run end-to-end tests against an integration fixture or a deployed fixture, and actually in between. So it's
okay. I mean, I think that's fine as long as we have the concept of an end-to-end test, which tests. You can imagine a user going through the user manual and saying, oh, if I create one of these things, what will happen is that, it'll end up in the underlying clusters. And if one of the clusters dies, this will happen, or whatever the case may be, and have a test that essentially codifies that and verifies that it does happen.
Well, I think that I would say for the most part, like we do need some full, I'm going to validate everything at a go. But the complexity of a distributed system doesn't suggest doing all the testing at that level. And ideally, we'd be able to do error cases separate from an end-to-end test. Like the corner cases would be evaluated in integration, or where you could really target just the failures, because you don't really have an opportunity to do effective fault injection with a deployed sort of scenario. Does that make sense?
Yes and no, I guess. I mean, I've personally written end-to-end tests that, for example, simulate packet loss between clusters or packet loss between nodes, and broken network interfaces and things. These were the I forget what they were called, but the Kubernetes failure tests. And it's not that hard, and it is very useful.
Not that it's hard, it's just that you can evaluate failure conditions in you can localize the failure. You don't necessarily have to propagate it all the way through to make sure that the correct behavior is correct.
Yeah. But I do think there's value in actually testing the end-to-end system and not doing it manually. I mean, I think today some of that stuff's being done manually and it's not reproducible. I guess my point is
suggesting manual testing, that's for sure.
I think unit tests are great. They're typically involve a lot of work for less value in the sense that they don't actually prove the system works, but they are valuable. Integration tests similarly are typically less work per amount of code coverage, but still not sufficient. And end-to-end tests are, I think, still valuable, and we shouldn't forget about them.
No, I don't think we're forgetting about them. We're just trying to make sure we get the best bang for the buck for the effort we put in.
And by all means, if the end-to-end tests can like leverage tooling that is created in the integration framework, that's great. You know, the ability to make a node fail or do this or do that, whatever. Let's build the libraries to make all of the testing easier to do and share between the libraries if necessary.
Yeah, and there is kind of an effort around trying to centralize development of that stuff. It's still pretty soon, but the hope would be that that picks up and we're able to actually pick up things like fault injection for free rather than having to maintain them separately from what the rest of Cube does.
Cool.
Do we have anything else we want to talk about?
Shashi, do you want to just share the problems you faced, or I mean, we can skip it also. If you
Yeah, I'm actually trying to integrate that external DNS. The same thing we discussed the last week. So actually, before that, I was just trying out the prototype thing, and I found like external DNS is kind of using little old packages, and I stuck with the dependency management of the different imports actually, which it is using. So I think okay, there are alternatives to do exactly like my main concern right now is to give out a crude implementation of it as soon as possible and give out a demo of that. To do that, there is a core DNS I was expecting, but that PR got stuck in external DNS almost like I think 6 months to 9 months. I think it is not moving ahead. So I think I got stuck over there actually. So the other one is like we could give the demo on GCE or some other environment like that. I think, that's pretty much it right now. I think I've been working out how to integrate that with like external DNS for our service discovery part actually. Last week I committed for writing up some doc so that we can discuss over that. But yeah, I'm delayed actually. Sorry for that.
Just to clarify, when you talk about integrating, you're just talking about building, like adding support in external DNS for interacting with the stuff you're going to build in Federation V2?
Yeah, the basic idea is like, okay, I did one PR a couple of days back. So that basically consolidates all the load balancer and whatever information required to program the DNS. That's a data type which we offer from Federation API. So an external component can make use of that particular data and program the DNS in whichever cloud provider they want. That's where we need to provide a source which can consume this data. So that particular source either could be in external DNS repo, or could be within Federation, or could be outside Federation also. But it is pretty much integratable. So it is built over the layers, right? So what I'm trying to do right now is try to implement a source for which consumes this data and produces the DNS records, generic DNS records, and feed off the controller in external DNS.
Okay. That's good.
I just had a crazy thought. So we have DNS provider at the moment, and it supports 5 or whatever it is external DNS providers, and it works. I wonder. I'm a bit hesitant about, and I'm getting a sense that external DNS might not be like sufficiently well supported, stroke robust. If we're stuck with PRs that are stuck for 9 months and whatever, I get a bit nervous that this might hold up our work. So one approach I can think of is to continue using DNS provider that we have right now, build a DNS provider that actually supports external DNS, which is a pretty simple exercise. I mean, I've built one of these things before in a weekend, actually. And then we can basically use either. So we can either plug DNS provider into external DNS and use external DNS and all of its, 7 or 8 or whatever it is providers, if and when it's stable. But at least we can use the existing ones we have already until we decide that is stable and workable. Don't want to create an overly complicated thing, but I don't want us to bet the farm on external DNS and then find out that it doesn't work when we already have something that does work.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that sounds like a good plan, actually. Yeah, that's pretty much doable with less effort, I believe.
I think having an abstraction layer makes sense, so it is pluggable. I would caution that the idea that we have something that's workable today, I think that's optimistic, because some of those providers may in fact work, but the reality is there's no CI that's validating all of them that I know of, at least not upstream. And the hope would be is that's the problem external DNS is going to solve, is it's going to take the maintenance burden off of us rather than just having stuff in the tree that we don't really have the expertise to maintain or evaluate on a regular basis. So I'm all for abstraction layer. I still think that external DNS is something we want to try to do if possible.
I agree. I just want us to not bet the farm on it today and then find out that it is holding us up.
Yeah, I mean,
what you say makes perfect sense.
Holding us back. It's definitely, especially like in this sort of early phase where we're just trying to de-risk things, getting stuck on something or adding unnecessary risk. I'm definitely in agreement that's not desirable.
Sure.
Yeah, somebody was trying to talk.
So whether or not this makes sense, but my hope would be is that the existing stuff that could be taken from V1, there could be kind of a shim that could read this new multi-cluster DNS resource. So there is kind of a separation of concerns, and that would kind of allow eventual integration with external DNS to be kind of in the model that we've discussed, rather than kind of doing some sort of something that diverges from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
It does, but Shashi, my suggestion would still be if you see external DNS repo, this particular PR, as you mentioned, might be stuck for some time, but they have some good amount of activity over there, and they have made many releases and a lot of contributors. So if we put something as what Maru just mentioned before this, that we have to maintain, right? And as Maru mentioned, we don't have a CI or anything to validate in the long term. So we won't even really know if that works always or not. right? So my suggestion would be that we can put some effort pushing that PR or pushing the changes which might be beneficial for Federation in external DNS itself, and maybe only that portion of changes or code or package, whatever it is, we can
Okay.
actively.
Yeah. We'll definitely try to do that particular part. Yeah, I haven't interacted with external DNS so far, so we'll try to pitch in with whatever I am trying to find, and it is aligned to our work.
Yes, and it's certainly agreeable that that might not move very fast, like not necessarily to our expectations.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sure
I
that
think,
will
yeah,
move.
the immediate plan could be good, like reusing our existing Federation and particular DNS providers. I think that we can do it off immediately. That would be good, I think. And yeah, and if at all we are doing this DNS providers, right? So would it be good to put it in some repo, a new repo, or in Federation V2 repo? What would everybody suggest?
Or a
I would
prototype.
suggest doing it as a separate repo, just because that would sort of have the same model as external DNS, and just build an image that the controller could be used to run. And so it'd be the same model. We're just going to run a controller somewhere that's going to consume this and program the DNS. And they're like, if and when external DNS becomes a thing, awesome. If it doesn't, having it out of tree kind of, I think, makes sense anyway, if that stuff is going to be the province of people who are experts in maintaining that versus maintaining Federation.
But sorry, I think I might disagree with that. We have the DNS provider code currently in the Federation, at least V1 repo. I don't know about V2. We have the API and providers for 5 DNS providers.
I mean, you could actually create something in Federation V1 repo
that's what I was thinking. Just
produce the image. Yeah, I agree.
And to be honest, at the moment, it's not actually an image separate process. It's just a library. So you just call the library, you link it into your thing, and that library itself could be exported out of V1 as a whatever the exportable library is, which is how it's done at the moment. You just import that code.
Right, but that would involve vendoring V1 code or copying a huge chunk of it in. And my suggestion is it would be lighter weight if you just took the working code, sort of had an entry point so it could run like independently of the rest of it and just produce an image. And then Federation V2 could simply consume that image.
It could. I guess I worry that may be biting off more than we want to chew when it can just use that library. But okay, I'll leave the mechanics to you guys.
I guess I don't think it's as simple as just using that library. Like the model we're proposing, where there's sort of a separation between something that's looking at cluster state and determining what DNS configuration that implies, and then using that to drive, like to configure and like DNS. That sort of model isn't in place for V1. And so I think like in order to sort of lay the groundwork for something like external DNS and to not take on responsibility in V2 repo for maintaining a bunch of code indefinitely, ideally we just have the separation that we've been discussing. Like it would still allow for reuse, it just requires a little bit of legwork to make it consumable. What do you think, Shashi?
Yeah, I think it should be okay. But I think separate repo, just holding the DNS provider. I think that's looks good to me. Only the process work I'm not sure of. Okay.
And is that preferable to just like creating a shim in a V1 repo and publishing an image out of that? Like, would you prefer to do it in a separate repo, or is it possible, do you think, to do it in V1? given that the code is already there.
Yeah.
I think the
I
most
think,
easy path forward to do this is if that DNS provider code could be put as a library somewhere else. Then V1 can also use it, just include it as a library and vendor it or whatever. And V2 can also either vendor it or include it whichever way it suits better.
I think that makes the most sense to me. I tell you, I'm hesitant about the approach Maru's proposing because the API at the moment is not designed as an external remote procedure call.
And it's not.
And the actual
intended to
library
be.
doesn't have any RPC capabilities or anything else.
But we're not talking about RPC though. My suggestion was to basically create a new controller that consumes the multi-cluster DNS resource and then calls the library, right? So
okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes. Sorry, I thought you were proposing turning DNS provider into a container.
No. It
If
would
you're not
be
proposing that, then I understand. Yes, that's totally
okay.
yeah.
So however that's done, I mean, I don't think it matters whether it's done in the V1 repo or in a totally new repo. I mean, whatever is more convenient or easier. But as long as an image can be published that then can consume the resource created in the Federation V2 controller and then program the DNS.
Yeah, I think, that's doable, I think, Muru.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
If we're done talking about that, actually, I wanted to kind of go back to discussing the way or sort of the plans to integrate different controllers in the Federation V2 repo. I think that, do we plan on releasing like all these controllers as part of one executable image? And if so, like it seems that we worked to decompose the API, that it might make sense ideally to see the API as a separate repo that can be consumed by a bunch of different controllers that live in separate repos outside of that. Does that make sense?
Kind of. No, it does make sense. In the near term, I'm not too concerned about providing this separation. In the longer term, I think it's necessary to put externally developed controllers in the same footing as internally developed ones. But in the near term, like we still have a lot of risk for just getting like the primary behavior done. And we don't have a lot of external contributors clamoring to do work with us. So I think it's important, but I don't know if it's a near-term priority. What other people think?
I agree with you, Maru. I think we should focus on a reference implementation, which is essentially what you're working on now. And then focus on making pieces of that reference implementation, individually consumable as a second phase.
And that's not to say that I don't think there should be the ability to deploy things conditionally or like I think that the controller manager we have today, it just runs everything. And similar to how Federation V1 works, where you can configure that, I'm kind of thinking that having component config, where the controller actually reads a config map to determine what it should do. That to me is sort of the starting point. And then in the future, we'll want to actually enable controllers to run separately, like as Ivan's suggesting. But it'll take some work. And Ivan, I mean, I'm not even sure how we're going to be publishing the API. I mean, my hope would be as we get to the point of being able to support CRDs, and it's kind of a gray and fuzzy to me how you publish a CRD API. I mean, I guess the client is involved, but
yeah, I see how moving to CRDs could definitely make this sort of a moot point. I just want to make sure that, since we worked on decomposing this, I think for the short term, it makes sense to bring it all together in one repo, but I want to prevent us from cornering ourselves in to where we support one controller manager image that supports all controllers.
Yeah.
with flags to disable each one, because then it sort of gives off that same monolithic impression that a lot of people were thinking FedV1 was about.
And I think, go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, Maru.
I think that, like, to some degree, having a monolithic controller manager is a little bit problematic. I think the more troubling implication is that it's hard for people outside of Federation to write their own controllers. And so I share your concern that, like, we need a way to allow the API to be consumed easily without having to vendor a whole bunch of controller code that, you know, isn't necessarily relevant. My hope would be that, like, we're using API Server Builder in the V2 repo today. When we get to CRDs, maybe that's the inflection point where we actually create a new repo that has the generated client, because you still generate a client for CRDs. And then the V2 repo consumes that. So we cut over kind of with CRDs moving the API out, and at that point it becomes easier for external developers to use the API. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. Sorry, you're calling. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was saying is that as an interim, it probably, and if that seems like a need, whenever it seems like the need, it probably would not be very difficult to have multiple binaries for the specific controller types or class of controllers from the same repo. And in API server also, we can have some feature gates kind of a thing, which can run the specific API or a kind of API, which probably is needed for that particular deployment.
I think that possibility, it's definitely doable. My reservation is that we haven't really gotten to the point of needing shared informers yet, but I can imagine that being a concern at scale. And so the advantage of one binary is that you can share informers between things that would otherwise have like their own caches and their own connections. But I'm just putting that out there. I'm not saying it's a reason not to have separate binaries. It's just something we need to consider.
Yeah, and also the static linking of the libraries could potentially bloat the code quite a bit if we have separate binaries. I'm not proposing against that, but just something to keep in mind.
That's kind of a funny thing. Like, the amount of code for each separate controller is not that great, but at the same time, when I've seen, like, if you look at the size of the binaries for API server and controller manager today, it's pretty large for what they do. I mean, the Cube infrastructure is not exactly efficient when it comes to binary size.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think your concern is, I mean, I think it's hypothetical now. When it comes time to actually deploy, to release something and to consider the implications for operationally, then all these things we'll have to worry about them. Right now, they're kind of hypotheticals because we have a lot to do to just make it usable.
Yeah, something we can revisit once we're at that inflection point.
Yeah, so it's good to sort of voice any of these concerns and sort of just get it in everyone's minds. And then when we hit these issues, we've had time to sort of ruminate and think about the consequences.
If we're looking for agenda items, I've got one other one that I could briefly put on the table. So I had assuming the previous conversation is finished, it seems like it had wound down.
Yeah, please.
Cool. So I undertook at the multi-cluster SIG meeting the other day to just clean up some of the slides, which I did. And I took the liberty of adding some proposed sort of rough, we had a sort of roadmap slide there. And I wanted to give some context as to what we think the next, steps look like in Federation, in particular, the Federation subproject of multi-cluster. So what I put down as a straw man there, and I wanted to just kind of float it around here and see if it seemed reasonable, was that we plan to have some alpha release of Federation v2 in the next, I would say, 3 to 6 months. Alpha meaning API not finalized, not production ready, not deployable, efficiently manageable in production, etc. And that approximately 3 months later, we would have something beta, and this doesn't need to be, all the bells and whistles, but just a usable subset of the envisaged API with a finalized API and working controllers that are not yet production ready, but that are the beginning of the GA release, and that we target having a GA release either at the end of 2018 or the beginning of 2019. Does that correlate with others' thinking at the moment?
Be honest, I hadn't really thought of the timeline for GA, and I don't know. I'd have to give it some thought as to whether we're going to be in a position to be GA by the end of the year. I mean, I definitely support the view that we kind of have to catch up to where V1 was in terms of acceptance and people's desire to use it. And at this point, they may require GA. Beta may not be enough. I think for me, the near-term objective would be figuring out a timeline for beta. Because that, to me, beta is, hey, you can use this. We have a reasonable degree of assurance that this is something that is not going to change radically.
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible approach. And my kind of stick figure for that is September-ish this year.
Mm-hmm.
So May, June, July, August, September. That's only 5 months away. So maybe more like October, November.
I think that's reasonable. And I think scope, setting a deadline, I think is good for sort of clarifying and getting people on the same page. And then the task will be scoping that. What does beta entail? What do we have to nail down before we want people to use it? So I think this is a good start. I'm not really keen on committing to dates or committing to deliverables, but I think this is sort of a good inflection point to start the discussion that will lead to formalizing that.
Okay, so how about we try and formalize a target date for beta
Scope.
in the next couple of weeks, I would propose that we sort of try and scope it such that we have a chance of hitting beta in October-ish.
Yeah, and maybe, yeah, I mean, to consider all the tasks that are required to get us there, including right now, I would say V2 is we're still kind of limping out of prototype phase. And I'd really like to get to the point where we have good testing in place, or at least the groundwork for good testing at all levels. Currently, there's no unit tests, which it's kind of it's a backfill exercise. And the rigor with which stuff has been tested I wouldn't say that it's great. It's not necessarily much different than V1, but I don't think that's sufficient for me to want to move to beta. So all that to say that I think the next few weeks, if we can lay out all the work items, what the scope is, all the work items required, and then sort of make sure that we can fit within the schedule. And if not, what can we deprioritize and do later?
That makes sense.
Okay.
The GA at the end of the year, I guess, initially strikes me as a little bit ambitious. But what ramifications are there for not being able to stick to that if we do publicly share that? In the Kubernetes community, I guess.
Is kind of pushed back past, we want to get to beta first. And in the process of doing that, I think we'll have a better sense of what it's going to take to get to GA. And if we've laid the groundwork, like good groundwork for beta, my hope would be that GA is a matter of incorporating user feedback, filling in the gaps that we might have missed in the process of getting to beta. And so to me, it's like it's an iterative learning process. Planning for GA before we really have laid the groundwork for beta seems a bit premature. Not saying we don't have a date. I don't think we can commit to it this early.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just make it clear. So by October, we will have been working on this project for 3 years. And I think if we can't produce a beta version by then, we need to question the feasibility of the project. So yeah, I would encourage us to push pretty hard for something like that. If we can't produce a beta in 3 years, then we have a bigger problem.
I guess I think that because we're kind of rebooting the idea that it's been 3 years, I mean, certainly the problem space has been worked on for 3 years, but this sort of new effort doesn't have quite as much mileage. I'd like to make sure we get things in the hands of customers, users, and they provide feedback. And I want to push harder on like actually getting that feedback so that when we move to beta, we're not codifying decisions that are hard to go back on, that we might have to go back on. So to me, it's all about like de-risking this. And so to my mind, like getting an alpha, getting something usable, getting an alpha that really interests like people who are very invested in the idea of this, they can start really pushing on it. That's to me is the first priority. And the second priority is making sure that we can transition with their feedback to beta, and then the wider pool of users who are more comfortable dealing with something that maybe is a bit more guaranteed. So to me, it's just a process. I'm happy that we're kind of discussing it now and starting to think about it, because it's going to be a long road and we really got to get started. So I'm with you, Quentin. I'm as usual, maybe a bit more cautious, but I kind of want to be traveling this road just as badly as you do, I think.
Yeah, I got interested by Ivan's question also. So he questioned about ramifications of not meeting GA. So what about the other two timelines also? Like we are thinking about uh, beta or alpha releases. Hello, am I audible?
Sorry, can you restate that?
Yeah, what might be ramifications of not meeting, like we define around June, we will be able to cut out some alpha, around September, we'll be able to cut out some beta, for at least some of the features. So we just keep these timelines, and whatever features we are able to, we mention them as alpha or beta, or we are talking about the whole project for alpha and beta during these timelines. And what happens if we don't really meet those timelines, if we are talking about this for the whole project?
I mean, the previous approach of codifying alpha or beta as like API based and saying, oh, well, deployments are this and replica sets are that. I think it's just a different model. Sorry, I'm hoping this is answering your question. I think like in the roadmap on the slide deck, we have like simple replication across clusters as like one item. And that's kind of like foundational, and I wouldn't expect that to change. Like it's the whole thing. So like, do I support replication of Kubernetes types, including CRDs? Yes, no. Like, is it alpha, is it beta? That's the whole thing. The higher level stuff, like, do I support specialized behavior for deployments or for services or that sort of thing? I think that could be more on like a feature that's an alpha or beta. I mean, this is kind of getting into the procedural weeds a little bit, because I think some of this stuff is like, some people.
No, I think I got the gist, Maru. I mean, I think that's reasonable also. So we mentioned that at least some foundational stuff for some set of API, we will strive or try to ensure that we can progress them to alpha, beta, or whatever. And higher level features which are bigger or something like that can take their own path as of progression.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, in the same way that we discussed yesterday about how it's not really about the, deployments are alpha or beta or GA, it's more about the feature that deployments enable, the concept of federation. And I think there's definitely room for having those being like alpha, beta, GA, but I don't know. I've never been particularly comfortable with how Cube sort of imagines alpha, beta, GA, because there's confusion about like the API types and then the underlying controllers or the overarching controllers or whatever. I mean, they're tied at the hip, but like one has to be totally fixed because that's how client behavior, or like the client interacts with the API. It has to be stable to some degree. But then the controller behavior, it has to have functional, guarantees, but its implementation can change. It can do more things, and it doesn't necessarily, to me, imply like unstable, stable, alpha, beta, whatever. And I know this is kind of like a bit meta, but I do think that it's relevant for federation because we're still targeting these types. We're still like sitting on top of this behavior, and so it influences how we think about the features we implement, I think. I kind of feel like I'm just talking about stuff nobody cares about.
No, I think you bring up good points, Maru. It seems like the versioning of the Kubernetes API sort of falls along that alpha, beta, GA versioning scheme. But when you talk about controllers and what features they enable in terms of those APIs, that does seem like there could be some variance there. And I'm not sure that Kubernetes has, at least I'm not aware of, a different versioning for feature sets that incorporate those APIs.
Right.
Just to go back to Shashi's question earlier, I'm not aware of, well, no company has told me that that the sky will come falling down or anyone will go bankrupt if we miss an alpha or beta deadline. But what I can say is that as someone kind of responsible for an engineering budget, if I, and this is not specific to my company, but if I try and put myself in the shoes of people in similar in other companies in similar roles, if there was a project that had been funded for however many years you choose to, set as the scope for this project, and hadn't produced a beta that people could use yet, I would defund the project. So I think that's, probably the biggest risk we have is that we get to the end of this year without a beta, and the companies that are currently funding the development decide that they no longer want to fund something that is permanently in pre-beta.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of like, it gets a little bit into sort of politics. And to my mind, like, if someone's actually paying attention to what's going on, things have ebbed and flowed. And at this point, like, we're in pretty serious development, and I don't think that's going to shift. And so, if someone wants to just see this from the outside and just consume something independently of interacting with the community or vendors like Huawei or Red Hat or anybody else that's like heavily involved, like, I don't know what to say. Like, that's not really how open source works. I totally understand your point. Like, we do have kind of a credibility problem within Federation if we can't deliver things that people find useful in a timely fashion. No question. But I think I don't think it's quite as clear as we haven't delivered something. Like, something was delivered, You know, people have actually been using it. I mean, we're always using it. Other companies are using it. It's just, I don't know, it's a bit fuzzy to me, like how we define like alpha, beta, whatever. We just need something useful that people can have some degree of confidence that it's going to be viable long term. Like whether it's alpha, beta, whatever is more like, do we have an active community that's going to continue working on this and maintaining it so that if you depend on it, you're not self-supporting. Like otherwise you might as well just write it yourself. I feel like I'm spinning wheels again. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're probably at time too.
Yeah, we have like 2 minutes left. I think that what you're saying really makes sense. I think that another risk that we face, not just meeting the versioning deadlines, but also competition with potential other projects, because users are asking for these types of features. So whether or not they get them from the Federation or the multi-cluster SIG versus either developing their own or going with some other solution out there is potentially a risk where another project could end up getting more momentum as a result.
Hey,
Or
anyway,
something new and shiny comes along.
yeah. And I apologize, Quentin. I have, whatever my opinions are, I agree with you that we just need to get something, we need to get to a point where we can deliver useful software in the hands of users and they have some degree of confidence that it's going to be supported. So to the degree that we agree on that, like, let's make a plan and make sure that we can get there.
Yeah, I mean, the name for that thing that you just described is beta. And,
Okay.
and that's what I think we need to aim for. And we can squabble about the, semantics of the word beta, but that thing that you just described is a beta release. And that's what we want to get out this year.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can devote time in the subsequent week's meetings to nailing down the scoping and the timing of this stuff. Does that sound reasonable? I mean, as well as actually doing the work to make it happen, but actually setting milestones and things like that. I think it's always good to have clarifying goals and to keep. We talked about OKR, so I'm in support of actually having these conversations and trying to sort of lay out a framework for success.
Yep, it makes sense. I'll put an agenda item for the next meeting. However, the next meeting next week, I think we would need to cancel because it conflicts with KubeCon.
KubeCon, right?
And the week after
I have
that,
to drop off, guys. Sorry. Cheers. Bye.
Ciao.
right. The week after that, some of us will have conflicts as well.
What is that? I mean, you are talking specific to Red Hat, or?
Yeah, some Red Hatters will be out as well.
Okay, I'll not cancel it, and probably if there isn't enough presence in that meeting, then we can wrap it up earlier or sooner. Make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Irfan.
Yeah. See you guys. Bye bye.
Thanks all. Ciao.
Bye.